Hello there and welcome to the Verbal Judo Australia online training program. My name is Trevor Lawson. I'm the Director of Verbal Judo Australia. I work for the Verbal Judo Institute and in the United States. So I've done this video just as a brief introduction into what Verbal Judo is all about and where it come from. So just quickly, Verbal Judo was created by the late Dr. George Thompson. Unfortunately, George passed away in 2011, so we lost a great man. But George had quite an eclectic background. At the age of 21, he became a high school English teacher, did that for a few years, then ended up going back to university and getting his PhD in English literature. So he became an English professor and taught the classics of Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, all that type of stuff, and oversaw a lot of students' writing programs. He did that for a few years and then ended up, funnily enough, becoming a police officer in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he's from in the mid-70s. He became a police officer. And what George found out was some of the best communicators that he'd ever met were police. Under pressure, in potentially violent situations, some of the police that he worked with were just absolutely fantastic at communicating. And this fascinated George, and he started to take a lot of notice of what they did. And look, long story short, he noticed that police were using two very old principles, okay? One from the West and one from the East. So first of all, the one from the West, he noticed that these police were using a principle that was written about by a gentleman named Aristotle. 2,500 years ago, Aristotle wrote a book called the Rhetorica, or the Book of Rhetoric. Now, all rhetoric means basically it's the art of persuasion, okay? So the ability to be able to choose the right verbal and non-verbal means of persuasion for any person in any given situation, okay? So they were using these techniques that Aristotle wrote about, but the police weren't aware of it. They were just using these techniques, and they were using techniques that they'd established over time had worked. So, and George knew a lot about Aristotle's work because some of his postdoctoral work was in rhetoric and persuasion when he was getting his PhD. So we've got the best in the West, Aristotle. Then the police were also using another technique, which was the philosophy of the East, the philosophy of the martial arts. Now, George knew a lot about this also because he had a black belt in Judo and he was had a lot of experience in karate and taekwondo. And so the principles of martial arts that these police were using without even realizing it were basically the principles of give way in order to control. In the martial arts, there's lots of different techniques, but there's one underlying principle that ties all martial arts together, and that is use your opponent's energy to move them where you need it to go, okay? Don't resist, redirect. An example that I like to use, if you can imagine two people in a physical altercation, right, and it's all about muscles, it's just a muscle contest. Who's going to win? That's right, the person with more muscles. In martial arts, they don't teach you to use sort of muscles or strength or force. They teach you to use technique. They teach you to think strategically. Okay, so the person in the martial arts that knows how to yield, that knows how to tactically give way to another person's energy, is the one that will win. It's exactly the same in a verbal encounter. Okay, verbal abuse, verbal resistance, typical people, whatever the situation may be, that's just resistance. How can you take that person's energy, right, and move them in the direction you need them to go? How can you redirect their behavior with your words, which is what verbal judo is all about, okay? So verbal judo is basically referred to as the gentle art of persuasion, redirecting behavior with words, okay? So that's where verbal judo come from. It became, George, after he worked there, why it worked, he developed a rudimentary training program, started teaching police, then the training program became more advanced, and started teaching police all across the United States. Now, verbal judo initially was a law enforcement training program. It became that effective with police. It protected officers, it prevented use of force, they were able to generate voluntary compliance, which is the goal of the verbal judo program, leave people better when they found them. Okay, and so it became that effective with police that non-law enforcement agencies started to contact George, big business, local government, hospitals, airlines, cruise ships, you name it. They were all contacting George, asking him if he could modify the training program that he had developed for police to suit them, which he did, and that is referred to as the contact professional training program. So we have a program for law enforcement and we have a program for non-law enforcement. So that's where verbal judo come from. It's considered one of the top training programs in the world. Myself, I stumbled across it late in my life, my professional life. Professionally, for about 23 years, I worked as a major public healthcare network in the western suburbs of Melbourne. I was a security professional, and I learnt early on in my professional career that the most powerful weapon you have is your ability to talk under pressure. And look, I've made a lot of mistakes. A lot of the mistakes we're going to be talking about in this training program, I have made. I can still make those mistakes. I try not to, and I make less of them. But I'm a human being. I'm afflicted with emotions and biases. I try to control them as best as I possibly can. But I'm a much better communicator now than I was in my early 30s. Okay. So, look, I hope you get a lot out of the training program. You'll get out of it what you put into it. Verbal judo, you need to practice it. But just one more thing. Dr. Thompson wrote 4 books on verbal judo. The first book he ever wrote was called Verbal Judo, Words as a Force Option. I would highly recommend this to anyone that wants to really get into the deep sort of nitty-gritty of verbal judo. This is probably my favorite book. The next one he wrote was Verbal Judo, Redirecting Behavior with Words. Another great little read. Probably the most popular verbal judo book amongst the most widely sold verbal judo book is Verbal Judo, The Gentle Art of Persuasion. This is closest to our 2-day training program, so I would highly recommend that. And the last book that George ever wrote was The Verbal Judo Way of Leadership, which is verbal judo tailored and aimed towards managers, supervisors, and leaders. So those people that have to have the responsibility of overseeing the work of other people. So we modified it to suit that audience as well. So that's a quick introduction to verbal judo. I really hope you enjoy the lessons. If you want any more information, I'll definitely read the books, but also feel free to contact me at verbaljudo.com.au. And yeah, so let's get stuck in the lesson. Enjoy. I'll see you soon.